What we're witnessing in Washington may represent the most significant shift in Republican Party dynamics since the Tea Party revolution of 2010. The convergence of legal pressures, institutional resistance, and internal fractures has created a moment that political observers are calling unprecedented in modern American politics. For months, we've tracked the growing tension between Donald Trump's continued grip on the Republican base and the mounting concerns of party institutionalists about electoral viability. What's emerged in recent weeks suggests this tension may finally be reaching a breaking point, with consequences that extend far beyond any single political figure or election cycle. The Republican Party has always been a coalition held together by shared policy goals, rather than personal loyalty to any individual leader. What we're seeing now appears to be a reassertion of that institutional identity, driven by what political analysts describe as a calculation that the cost of continued alignment has begun to outweigh the benefits. According to multiple reports from Capitol Hill sources, private conversations among Republican senators have grown increasingly frank about electoral concerns heading into 2024 and beyond. The suburban losses in recent election cycles, combined with polling data showing persistent challenges with independent voters, have created what one veteran operative described as an existential anxiety within the party apparatus. This isn't simply about personal animosity or policy disagreements. Political scientists who study party dynamics suggest we're witnessing what they call institutional self-preservation, where the long-term interests of the party as an organization begin to diverge from the short-term political power of its most prominent figure. The mechanism for this shift appears to be playing out through the traditional levers of party influence. Senate leadership, which controls committee assignments, fundraising apparatus, and legislative priorities, wields enormous power over the careers of individual members. When that leadership begins to signal a change in direction, even subtly, it creates what political observers call a permission structure for other members to follow suit. What makes this moment particularly complex is the intersection of political strategy with ongoing legal proceedings. Legal analysts note that the various investigations and court cases involving Trump have created a unique dynamic where political and legal timelines are colliding in ways we haven't seen before in American politics. The institutional response we're observing may be influenced by what legal experts describe as risk assessment. When political figures face potential criminal liability, their allies often engage in what attorneys call distancing behavior, not necessarily out of disloyalty, but out of legal necessity. This creates a feedback loop where political isolation increases legal vulnerability, which in turn increases political isolation. Constitutional law scholars who have studied similar dynamics in other democratic systems note that this pattern often accelerates once it begins, as each participant seeks to minimize their own exposure. The Republican Party's institutional leadership appears to be navigating this reality by creating what political strategists call optionality. Rather than burning bridges entirely, they're positioning themselves to respond to various potential outcomes while preserving their own political viability, regardless of how legal proceedings conclude. What we're witnessing appears to be a carefully orchestrated process rather than a spontaneous rebellion. Political scientists who study party dynamics note that successful challenges to incumbent leadership typically require what they call coordination mechanisms, ways for potential defectors to signal their intentions without exposing themselves to retaliation. The traditional tools for this coordination include private donor conversations, closed-door caucus meetings, and strategic media leaks. Multiple reports suggest all three mechanisms have been active in recent months, creating what one former party official described as a slow-motion realignment of incentives and expectations. The role of major donors in this process cannot be understated. Political finance experts note that large contributors often serve as early warning systems for parties, withdrawing support when they perceive fundamental problems with electoral strategy or candidate viability. The conversations happening in these circles often precede and predict broader political movements. What makes this situation particularly significant is that it involves donors who have historically been supportive of Trump's political operation. When even friendly financial backers begin expressing concerns, it creates what campaign professionals call a legitimacy crisis, where the fundamental assumptions about electability come under question. The United States Senate, by design, operates as what the founders intended to be a cooling chamber for political passions. The 6 year terms and staggered elections create incentives for longer term thinking that can sometimes diverge from immediate political pressures. Constitutional scholars note that the Senate has historically served as a check on executive power, regardless of party affiliation. What we may be seeing now is the institution reasserting that constitutional role, particularly as questions about democratic norms and rule of law have become central to national political discourse. The specific mechanisms available to Senate leadership include control over the legislative agenda, committee structures, and party resources. When leadership signals a shift in priorities, it creates cascading effects throughout the entire Republican political ecosystem, from state parties to advocacy groups to media allies. Political historians who have studied similar moments note that institutional resistance often builds slowly and then manifests suddenly. The appearance of coordination may actually reflect months or years of private conversations and relationship building among senators who share similar concerns about party direction. Beneath the constitutional and institutional arguments lies a cold political calculation about electoral viability. Republican strategists have access to detailed polling and demographic data that often differs significantly from public surveys, and these internal numbers appear to be driving much of the strategic thinking we're observing. The particular concern, according to political analysts, involves what they call the suburban problem. The Republican Party's losses among college-educated voters, particularly women in suburban districts, have created mathematical challenges for statewide races that some strategists believe are becoming insurmountable under current conditions. This electoral reality creates what political scientists call a principal agent problem, where the interests of individual politicians seeking re-election begin to diverge from the interests of the party's most prominent national figure. Senators facing competitive races in purple states have different incentive structures than those in safe red seats, and this divergence appears to be manifesting in the private conversations that drive party strategy. The timing of any potential institutional move would likely be influenced by these electoral considerations. Political strategists note that major party realignments typically occur in windows between election cycles, when the immediate pressure of campaigning is reduced and longer-term strategic thinking can prevail. American political history provides several examples of moments when institutional pressure led to significant changes in party leadership or direction. The resignation of Richard Nixon while involving a Democratic Congress required Republican leaders to effectively abandon their defense of a president from their own party when continued support became untenable. More recently, the Tea Party movement demonstrated how grassroots energy could force established party leadership to adapt or be replaced. However, what we're observing now may represent the reverse dynamic, where institutional leadership is attempting to reassert control over grassroots energy that they view as politically damaging. Political historians note that these institutional moments often appear sudden to outside observers, but typically result from months or years of private pressure and relationship building. The visible manifestation of change usually represents the conclusion of a process rather than its beginning. The success of any institutional challenge depends heavily on timing, coordination, and the availability of alternative leadership. Political scientists who study these dynamics suggest that successful transitions require not just dissatisfaction with current leadership, but also consensus around a viable alternative path forward. One of the most significant aspects of this potential shift involves the changing dynamics of media coverage and message discipline. For years, Trump's ability to dominate news cycles and frame political narratives has been a source of power within the Republican Party. Any successful institutional challenge would need to overcome this communications advantage. Political communication experts note that traditional party apparatus, including Senate leadership and major donors, retain significant influence over mainstream media coverage and editorial decisions. This influence can be particularly important in shaping how political developments are framed and interpreted for general audiences. The emergence of alternative media ecosystems, particularly on social media, has complicated this dynamic significantly. However, institutional leaders appear to be betting that their influence over traditional gatekeepers in journalism and political commentary remains substantial enough to shape broader narratives about party direction and leadership legitimacy. What we're seeing may represent a test of whether traditional institutional power can reassert itself in an era of direct communication between political figures and their bases. The outcome of this test could have implications that extend far beyond any individual political career or election cycle. The broader significance of what we're observing extends beyond partisan politics to fundamental questions about how American democratic institutions function under stress. The peaceful transfer of power and the rule of law depend on political leaders accepting certain norms and constraints, even when those constraints conflict with immediate political interests. Constitutional scholars note that the American system was designed with the assumption that ambitious politicians would check each other's power, creating what James Madison called ambition counteracting ambition. What we may be witnessing is this constitutional mechanism operating as intended, with institutional leaders prioritizing the long-term health of democratic norms over short-term political loyalty. The international implications of this domestic political development should not be overlooked. America's allies and adversaries are closely watching how American institutions respond to challenges to democratic norms. The strength of institutional resistance sends signals about the resilience of American democracy that reverberate far beyond our borders. Political scientists who study democratic transitions note that moments of institutional stress often serve as tests of systemic durability. How American institutions respond to current challenges will likely influence how they're perceived and how they function for decades to come. As this institutional moment continues to unfold, several key factors will determine its ultimate trajectory and significance. The response from Trump's base of support, the reaction of major donors and advocacy groups, and the willingness of individual Republicans to risk primary challenges will all play crucial roles in shaping what happens next. Political analysts suggest that we're likely to see this dynamic play out over months rather than days, with various pressure points and decision moments that could either accelerate institutional change or reinforce existing power structures. The traditional tools of political influence, from fundraising to media coverage to primary elections, will all be tested in this evolving situation. What remains clear is that the Republican Party is facing questions about its future direction that go to the heart of its identity as an institution. Whether this leads to fundamental change or simply reinforces existing patterns will depend on factors that are still developing and decisions that haven't yet been made. The broader American political system is watching this institutional stress test with enormous interest. How the Republican Party navigates this moment will likely influence political dynamics for years to come, regardless of the specific outcomes of any individual election or legal proceeding. Whether we're witnessing the beginning of a significant political realignment or simply another chapter in ongoing partisan conflict remains an open question. What's certain is that the institutional mechanisms of American democracy are being tested in ways that will likely have lasting consequences for how our political system functions in the years ahead. The ultimate verdict on this moment will be written not by pundits or political analysts, but by the American voters who will ultimately decide whether institutional resistance to political disruption represents a defense of democratic norms or an obstacle to necessary change. That judgment will shape not only the immediate political landscape, but the long-term trajectory of American democracy itself.